Alright guys, I know it's been a while since I posted anything significant, so today we're going to have a fun conversation, mostly because I'm sick of answering these questions. This is in no way a completely all-covering, all-encompassing conversation, but it's a good start for most people. So very often when I'm dealing with a client who's got an injury, who's got a pain, who's got some sort of movement limitation, we start with breathing. When I say very often, basically always. And I get asked all the time, well, my knee hurts, why are we starting with breathing? My shoulder hurts, why are we starting with breathing? It's a very good question because it seems a little bit batshit crazy to start there. It seems completely unrelated. But the reality is the movement that we do the most throughout the day, for most people it's going to be 22, 23,000 times a day, is breathing. If we did any other movement incorrectly or not in a great way that many times, we would almost certainly have some sort of issue. Now, beyond that very obvious fact, we also have structural changes that happen from breath. It's inarguable, okay? In the ideal world, now bear in mind, a lot of people don't breathe ideally. We have our fantastic rib cage here. This is pudding. And what should happen when we're in an exhaled state is both sides of the diaphragm, both hemidiaphragm, should dome up here like this. When we inhale, they flatten down. When we exhale, they dome up, okay? Now, their ability to dome up is dependent on the ability of the rib cage to compress, come in, okay? To internally rotate both sides. If you imagine the rib cage has two sides, which it does, that can both move independently. As you exhale, what should happen is we should go closing the barn doors. It retracts and the ribs depress. They come down and back, okay, as they come in. That should happen on an exhalation. Now, for most people, for a variety of reasons that are beyond the scope of this conversation today, that doesn't happen completely. So what we end up with a rib cage that's big and flared, or what some people think is ideal posture. It's very like a military posture. It is not. It's mostly fucking terrible for a lot of reasons. Now, when we have that big flared posture, what happens is my diaphragm, or diaphragms, hemidiaphragms in here, gets stretched. You can imagine if the rib cage gets bigger, the diaphragm gets stretched out, and now it has a limited ability to descend. Well, when you can't descend, we're kind of in a bit of a pickle, because our options are either find a new way to breathe or don't breathe. We'll say that, you know, plan B is not our best plan here, so we're going to find a new way to breathe. Now, for most people, as they find that new way to breathe, it becomes an elevatory pattern of breathing. And what I mean by that is, when they inhale, everything comes upwards. So instead of a diaphragm descending when you inhale, the rib cage ascends. And that puts a lot of tension in muscles like the sternocleidomastoids. I always say to everybody, if you have a neck that looks like mine, you probably have an issue. My issues are pretty much sorted now, but it can take a while. So it ends up with SCMs, upper trapezius, subclavius muscles, scalenes, a lot of overactivity in and around the neck to pull everything up. So if you're someone who goes to a massage therapist or someone who holds their tension in the neck, the chances are you don't necessarily hold your tension or your stress in your neck. That's a very ambiguous granola way to describe it. But the chances are that you breathe mostly with your neck and don't descend the diaphragm well. Now, that's all well and good, but who gives a shit about that as relates to a shoulder or a knee issue? I'm getting there, I promise. Okay? So, when we have a shoulder, when we have a scapula, that scapula sits on a rib cage. Okay? Again, I really hope at this point nobody is denying that a scapula and a rib cage are pretty close together, right? When this rib cage gets circumferentially bigger, it moves the scapula and changes the relative range of motion available to a scapula. If you imagine I have a set of train tracks, okay? And the train can move 1 mile along the tracks and backward or forward, obviously. All of a sudden the tracks get longer, but the train can still only move 1 mile. Now the train doesn't get to the end of the tracks. It's the same idea. As the rib cage gets circumferentially bigger, now all of a sudden the range of motion the scapula has doesn't move it the whole way across the rib cage. Again, I'm massively oversimplifying here, guys. But if we don't address the surface the scapula sits on, the rib cage, then we can't address scapular range of motion. We can't address things like horizontal humeral abduction, shoulder flexion, these sorts of things that demand a lot of scapular motion, okay? The same thing for things like epicondylitis, tendonitis in the elbow. As this happens, as this expansion and concomitant rotation happens, this external rotation as we're overexpanded, that also forces a layer of rotation into the humerus, okay? So we're having, again, upper arm that can be rotated. Same thing for a pelvis. So we've got our pelvis over here. I'm gonna exaggerate these things, and yes, I'm oversimplifying, so don't get panties in a bunch, please. If we're in an overexpanded state, you're typically gonna see a pelvis that's anteriorly tilted. Now, when we talk about these states are not inherently bad. They're only inherently bad to be stuck in. Any state is inherently bad to always be stuck in and not have other movement options, okay? Don't come at me with extension is bad, expansion is bad. Those things are necessary. But to be stuck in any one state, in any one joint, is a problem, okay? So as we inhale, what typically happens is as the diaphragm descends, it pulls down, it goes, if we're working well, this rib cage is in a great position. It pushes down viscera, pushes down organs, that sort of stuff. In here, we have another diaphragm that runs, in the ideal world, parallel to that one. So as you inhale through the thoracic diaphragm, it pushes down, and organs, viscera, liquid, intestines, all this stuff pushes down. In the ideal world, this descends, and as we exhale, ascends. The pelvic floor is also a pelvic diaphragm. Now, the descension and function of this pelvic floor is, to a large extent, dependent on that descending pressure. That's why when we have a pelvic floor patient, or pelvic floor client, if they have someone with sciatica, I'm concerned about the breath before that, because their pelvic floor regulation is interdependent on their thoracic diaphragm regulation. In other words, in English, how you breathe affects your pelvic floor. Okay? Now, how you breathe also affects your pelvis, because as those ribs come up and out, this is not a big extended posture talk about the rib cage. I'm also wearing a big hoodie, or a big sweater today, doesn't help. But as that comes up, we see an arching in the low back. That arching in the low back means that the lower back muscles are on. And if you're stuck in that position, they're always on. So if you have a tight lower back, if you have lower back pain, that may be related. Often is. Not always, but often. So as the pelvis rolls forward like this, you can see these innominate bones, these big hip bones, flare out. A little bit of that is normal to happen on inhalation. But if the pelvic floor can't descend, what we get is distension. That's when we get belly breathing, which a lot of people conflate for real diaphragmatic breathing. Okay? That's when we get. Now, if the pelvic floor is appropriately descending, then we don't get that distension. If we do get that distension, if when we inhale, everything goes up, or if the belly goes out like that, the pelvis gets dumped forward a little bit, and now we're stuck in a state. If I'm not touching those femurs are now starting to turn out, okay? Like so. So we're getting externally rotated there. So, and I know I'm going through a lot of information here, guys. I'm going to cover all of this very soon in a product directly for consumers, not fitness professionals. It's going to be a guide on how to get around this sort of stuff. But when we have someone who's trying to squat, for example, and they're very, very often cued by the fitness industry and by other professionals to drive knees out, to hold themselves in a certain position, there are phasic motions, okay? So a normal weight-bearing position for a standing human being should, if we're in a single leg stance of some form, or like a biased stance, the sphenoid bone, which is the bone right here, should be over the sternum, should be over the sacrum, should be over the foot. And if you do that, balance is really, really easy. It's not a skill, it's gravity holding you there. When people often talk about, especially yoga people, especially people who do breathwork, talk about getting grounded. Grounded is really experiencing appropriate ground reaction force, some gravity pushing you down to the floor. It's not going and kissing a bunch of grass and hugging a tree. Again, all for environmental conservancy, sure, it's great, but that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about being physically pulled down by gravity and accepting gravity with joint and muscle orientation. Okay, that is dependent on rib cage position. Again, this is not a how to fix this today. This is just a TLDR version of the why. So let's say that person who needs to squat, okay? If their femurs are stuck in this externally rotated position, this turned out position, they're in trouble, because at the top, we should be in that internally rotated position for the most part. There are exceptions to that, but if we're in a bilateral position, standing normally, about to squat, with a bar, without a bar, doesn't make a difference. As we bend towards 90 degrees, the femurs will turn out if you're a human being with legs. As we get towards 90, they'll come back in. As we get towards the bottom, they'll come back out. Okay? That is how a femur works as it bends. That's how the knee and upper leg bend, when they bend that way, that's what happens in terms of rotation. If you're already the whole way turned out, as you bend, you're going to create torque. If you're unlucky, that torque can result in injury. If you're lucky, you don't feel anything from it. Very, very often when we talk about this sort of stuff, survivorship bias comes out there. People say, well, powerlifters do this and this person does that. I don't really give a shit. I'm telling you how joints move. Some people will survive no matter what you throw at them. A perfect example of that, we look at the 1970s and 80s Olympic programs for like Eastern Europe. They put hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of athletes through these programs, and most of them would break. They would get hurt. The ones that survived were the ones that became champions. It wasn't because the program was great. It's because that person was just someone who's naturally resilient and naturally athletic. So when you're talking about injury and technique like this, we have to take into account the people at the peak of almost any sport are going to play into survivorship bias. Just because they've done phenomenally well does not mean what they did made them phenomenal. You take someone like a famous basketball player, I'm not even going to name the name. You all know who I'm talking about. He's a famous basketball player who famously trains like trash. But that guy is so damn good, so talented, so gifted and a hard worker that it doesn't really matter what he does, he'll be exceptional at it. That's not necessarily a product of the training. It's more so in spite of the training. And unfortunately, a lot of the fitness industry moves in the same direction. A lot of our clients are successful in spite of what we do, not because of it. And even more so when we talk about athletes. We talk about physique, we talk about bodybuilding, we talk about powerlifting. I think the fitness industry actually does a pretty good job there for the most part. We talk about, and I don't like to use the word function because it's been bastardized quite a lot, but we talk about function. The ability to generate power does not make an athlete. The ability to generate, preserve, and transfer power to a different limb or object from top to bottom, front to back, left to right. That's what makes someone athletic. And that's what the fitness industry lacks. There's a focus on stability at the cost of transferability of power. Again, this is just a conversation, guys. I want you guys to kind of get into my headspace for what's going to come later. My buddy Sean Light talks about this. He talks about he's an NBA strength coach, and a lot of the guys that were phenomenal in the gym were just not that great on the court. And I think a large part of that is, number one, there's a couple of things. People who are just phenomenal on the court don't see the need to spend the time in the gym. I'm not saying gym work can't help. Any sport, it can. But appropriately applied gym work can. If we're doing movements for most athletes to make us stiff and make us rigid, make us resist movement, we can't yield and explode. We can't load the spring, explode the spring. We need to have movement options in sport. And the more rigid, the more stable you make an athlete, obviously within reason. If someone's super unstable, they need some stability, but they need to be able to turn that on and off. They need to create stiffness and then use that stiffness to create elasticity, to create power, to express power, and more importantly, to transfer power. Does that make sense? If that wasn't the case, I talked about this with my buddy Robbie Burke on his All Things Strength podcast recently. If that wasn't the case, powerlifters would be the best athletes, and strongmen would be the best athletes all around in basically every sport. That's not me complaining or shitting on either of those sports. They're both fantastic sports. But what they do is not applicable or relevant, for the most part, to general population, to random Joe Punter in the gym. Okay, guys? So training like a powerlifter, training like a bodybuilder is great if you want to be a powerlifter or bodybuilder. For everybody else, it's probably the wrong move. I know I'm not giving you guys a lot of actionable information right now, but it is coming. Thanks.